All about this. It's possible that there's some other root to the stigma, but I assume that at the core of the stigma, behind all of these dimensions, or at least many of these dimensions, so the moral dimension, intellectual, social status, sexual status, is the idea that being fat is unhealthy for you. I assume that that is sort of at the core of a lot of people's minds that underlies. There could be something else. There could be sort of disgust reactions or something like that that's different. But I assume that health underlies a lot of the stigma. So the debate, I assume, for a lot of people is going to be around that. It's going to be, so being fat is unhealthy for you. By being fat and it being unhealthy, it leads to all these other problems. And so people are going to justify their other attitudes on that. Do you think that's what's going on? And so that's the first question. The second question is, can you speak a bit more about what are the correlations, what are the relationships between health and weight?
I think it is a big piece of the puzzle. It isn't historically the way fat phobia came to be, and this will highlight the chicken and egg aspect to it, where it's often a question of, do we assume fat people are unhealthy because we're fat phobic, or are we fat phobic because we assume fat people are unhealthy? And I think it's really a both and answer, but historically, the belief that fat bodies were associated with being somehow primitive, I put in big scare quotes there, even, again, big square quotes, savage, that really came about through racism. So the origins of fat phobia predate the medical construction of a problematic fat body in interesting ways that I just want to briefly highlight before I get into the important question that you raised about the relationship between weight and health. So what Sabrina Strings, the sociologist from UCLA, argues in her book, the Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, is that fatness was largely seen as a benign, even positive characteristic, especially for women, until the mid-18th century. So it's not to say there were dribs and drabs of fat phobia or elements of ambivalence towards the fat body historically, but it wasn't a systemic force until the mid-18th century, where what happened in Anglo-American culture was that British pseudoscientists and colonizers had to, by necessity, because of their own racist practices, where the transatlantic slave trade was burgeoning so quickly and dramatically, they had to try to come up with a reason why black bodies and white bodies were so different from each other, which is of course false. So what they invented, again from the armchair, was this idea of a fat black body. The idea that black people are much larger and were more suitable for certain kinds of labor, actually, because of the bulk of their bodies, and also that there were big differences between the bodies of black versus white women, where white women were much more dainty and black women were larger. And this wasn't based on observation. A lot of these men had never been to the relevant parts of Africa. But from the armchair, they made this speculative hypothesis that they then theorized and took hold socially, where it's important to be clear about the order here. It's not that fatness was seen as negative and then associated with blackness. It's that blackness was associated with fatness, and then fatness came to be derogated shortly thereafter. And it wasn't until the advent of health insurance nearly a century later, and arguably even 150 years later in the early 20th century, that the medicalization of fatness became a thing. And the invention of actuarial tables designed to see the relationship between someone's weight and height led to people making generalizations based on the kind of people who were buying health insurance, namely white men who were professionally employed. Then people began to make generalizations within the medical community about fat bodies being unhealthy. So it's actually really interesting that the racist origins of fat phobia predate the medical theories about fat bodies being unhealthy, But of course, that doesn't mean, thinking about things like the genetic fallacy, that it's incorrect that fat bodies are unhealthy. Maybe that's independently true. So let's delve into that.